trees were planted by the Right Honourable the Marquess of Salisbury, United Kingdom, and the Right Honourable Arthur Henderson on the occasion of the meeting of the delegates of the Empire Parliamentary Association at Canberra on the 11th of October 1926. These trees have graced this courtyard and this building for over 60 years. When Parliament first met here, they were but wisps, and I was a babe in arms. The building they have adorned is soon to be vacated and put to other uses. This is its story. The journalists when I was here were never as courteous as you. Here in King's Hall, the gathering place of legend, one feels the personal force of history as in no other place. To me, so many of the painted faces are speaking as they did in life. The Labour Party, comrade, will, I think, be the death of me. Remember, Jimmy, not all the good bowlers are on the one team.
No, I want you right out.
William Morris Hughes, a member of the Australian Parliament for 51 years and Prime Minister for over 6 years. He once boasted he was a founding member of the Labour Party, the Nationalist Party, the United Australia Party and the Liberal Party. Why is it, he was once asked, you never joined the Country Party? He replied, brother, you have to draw the line somewhere. This was one of our most eminent speakers, Archie Cameron, who refused as a Catholic to take the oath on the King James Bible or any other Bible, asserting that if the word of a Cameron was not acceptable, no gathering of Bibles could improve on it. And this is John Curtin, some say the greatest Australian Prime Minister, who during World War II would stay up all night in the Prime Minister's lodge, pacing and worrying, deeply concerned about the men in uniform he was sending perhaps to their doom. Ben Chifley, who refused to live in the Prime Minister's lodge, preferring in a time of austerity the Currajong Hotel and a 10 by 14 foot room with a sink and a toilet down the hall. Other men recalled here were more complex and divide opinion still. Sir Robert Menzies, huge, implacable, eloquent, the most lucid advocate of his time, and over 17 consecutive years, the longest serving British Prime Minister, I think, since William Pitt. He was the great undeniable political fact of 3 Australian generations. When he walked in and out, it was like a pageant. When he spoke, it was with a persuasiveness that could, I once said, turn a Sao biscuit into a Lamington. A watchful, Epicurean, territorial man, not wholly immune to flattery, greatly fond of martinis and Houghton's wine, a keen follower of Australian rules football and Test cricket and British royalty. He crushed rivals, tormented oppositions, squashed interjectors, read Shakespeare through every couple of years and learnt from him. But he knew his limits too. The day you take Parliament for granted, Killen, he said, you are finished. I admired him and held him in the greatest affection. Towards the end of his life, he said to me, Killen, I have to confess, I've had doubts about your judgment. I looked at him and said, what an extraordinary coincidence. He roared with laughter. That calls, he said, for another drink. One cannot easily convey how much is contained here in these carved and painted memorials. The energy and personality exerted and wasted, the years misspent, the issues lost, the bauble reputation reached for and sometimes but not often attained, the hard work forgotten, the health damaged, the pride broken, the selfless patriotism unremarked. the private lives deranged. The great moments witnessed, like this, the first joint sitting of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The moments once vivid and living and powerful, soon to be packed away. Yesterday's news. It's astonishing to think how soon all this will be gone, into furniture vans and mothballs to pass from our national memory. The heart of a nation transplanted elsewhere. Radical surgery, surely, and for reasons that many people think are insufficient. But the tide of history moves on, bearing all such flotsam before it, and will not be stilled or hindered by any wishful thinking. To the dominating feature of King's Hall, this statue of King George V, there attaches a particular mystery. It is this. But the explanation is very simple. Generations of journalists, as they grew listless in this legendary place, waiting for a story to break, polished it with their sleeves to its present glow. This is the parliamentary billiard room. The talk here wasn't always about billiards or snooker. Many a game I've had here with Sir John McEwen. His advice on politics, robust, sound and down to earth. And with me is my old friend Fred Daly, who for many years ran the Parliamentary Billiard Championship.
If you have a look at the board over there, the Parliamentary Billiard Board, you'll see a gap of 11 years after 1954. That's significant because that's when the Labor split took place. And at that time it was a bit dangerous to give members a billiard cue. They might have been used for other purposes.
Well, here it is, back in an old haunt. You think it's changed? Hello, Tony.
Good afternoon, the Honourable Gentleman.
How are you?
Very well.
Same again.
The usual, please.
I think it's changed a lot, Jim. The atmosphere is different. This used to be a convivial spot, even at this hour of the day. I can recall when this was one of the few bars you could get a drink in on Sunday. And between 11 and 12, Jack Murphy stood behind the bar. We declared it the Catholic hour, and those members that were here drank. If there were visitors with us, they belonged to the Queensland Upper House. Made them eligible.
When was that abolished?
Oh, about 30 years before, but never been accurate, you know, parliamentarians. And this was a great community centre days gone by. Now, of course, different habits, more educated members. They drink in their rooms. It's not they've given it up, but I think this has slipped a bit in that regard, and nearly fire a shotgun here now, I think, before dinner of a night.
Are you tempted to?
Occasionally.
Yeah.
Might eat a Liberal.
Yeah.
All in all, I think a lot of that old spirit's gone. And it was always nice to have a beer, and particularly after a ballot, you'd come in here and say, I'll tell you how I won that one or how I got done. And you'd work out how you're going to do somebody else the next time round. But you can do it most congenially over a beer, particularly when you have a couple of extra ones.
You remember the story of Billy Hughes playing snooker, and he brought off an impossible shot, and he turned to his opponent and said, I suppose you thought that was a fluke. And the fellow, not wishing to hurt the old man's feelings, said, no, not at all. Well, brother, that's where you're wrong. It was an absolute bloody miracle.
Yeah, funny old man Billy, you know. He was 8 stone 6 ringing wet, deaf as a beetle, ugly as sin, and I reckon he had more twists than a bottle of worms.
Really?
Yeah.
And you recall the day that I accused you of suffering from the Munchausen syndrome?
Yeah, that was remarkable. I thought it was favourite for the Caulfield Cup.
Do you remember when I appeared professionally for one of your colleagues who asked you, James Killen, what's he really like? And you replied, well, he appeared in a murder trial.
Yeah.
And he then said, what happened? And you replied, they hung the judge.
I did, yes, that's true.
Well, this place has changed, hasn't it?
Immensely.
Do you remember the little Molonglo River that meandered through here before the lake was built?
I did, and I remembered when I stood outside the front of Parliament House, the sheep would wander across, and now a few have wandered inside. Yeah.
Who was it who said that Canberra was a good sheep station spoiled?
I think it was Everett, and of course he described it once as a place hot as hell in the summer, cold as ice in the winter, and about as interesting as wandering around with a paper bag over your head.
The argument over the lake itself, Lake Burley Griffin, do you remember that a superb speech of Leslie Hale, and the Labor member for Parks, where he said, I thought it would be a good idea because members can walk round the lake reciting poetry to purify their thoughts and to give them a far greater elegance inside the Parliament.
Yes, Les was a great one for purity. He never practiced it, but he believed in it.
Surprisingly, it was left to a Supreme Court judge from India to observe the waters of the Thames and of the Potomac both flow into Lake Burley-Griffin. I think that's very true.
No, it's too deep for me, Jim. I'm not as educated as your average Indian.
Ah, yes. We have heard the chimes at midnight, Master Shallow.
You said it.
On a day like this, it is easy to miss Canberra. There is a poem by Les Murray, A Canberra Remnant. Eavesdropping rain, a quiet car, a sense of mountains in the air, dark houses sleeping beneath the freezing drip of European trees, lost paddock and stone under the lake, and only a few souls still awake to polish a bead, to turn a page, to label a fly or a golden age. In 1,000 redeeming projects they keep safe from the government of the day. Old days, old ways. This is a trove for me of what the Aborigines call sacred sites, places for which I have a particular affinity. I could wander here forever, an old ghost among his earthly treasures, frightening passers-by. I once knew as a close friend the only man ever to fall from the press gallery onto the floor of Parliament. It was said that at the time he was somewhat Mozart and Liszt. Needless to say, he was a journalist. Here is where the legends are manufactured and the fate of the nation and its leaders wittingly and unwittingly decreed. It was in these cramped, unruly offices that the famous cat's cries on which the fortunes of government hung were first invented. Pig-Iron Bob, the 36 faceless men, the night of the long prawns, the Morosi affair, the Paddington Bear affair, and the many other cat's cries spiked and flung in the trash can, unused. Because Canberra is remote from what we know as metropolitan civilization, the power of the men in these offices to shape and mould and exaggerate its image is immense. They play a delicate and dangerous game of somehow through it all maintaining the goodwill of the men they daily deride. This interrelationship is at least as intricate and its manners as ambiguous as the court of the Sun King Louis XIV at Versailles. Yes, yesterday's news. This is a place where great power is exerted and where public opinion throughout Australia is influenced. Whether responsibly or irresponsibly, that depends which side of the argument you are on. This is the non-members' bar, where journalists and some members of Parliament socialise, gather, discuss and gossip and, of course, talk about politics. With me today are four well-known Australian journalists: Michelle Grattan of The Age, Paul Kelly of The Australian, Richard Carlton, and my old friend Wallace Brown of the Courier Mail. Will you be sorry to leave this place?
In a sense, I suppose, Jim, this house is a bit like a mistress, I guess. You do all sorts of things here. You work here, you drink here, you eat here. You spend the majority of your 24 hours in this building when the house is in session. And I think in that sense, a lot of people have regrets about leaving to go to the new place on the hill.
Jim, the conditions here are so outrageous. They are so primitive. No one can truly be sad to give them up.
They're also very efficient, though. Yeah,
Why do
right.
you say that, Wally?
Because they're so close. 30 seconds from the House, 30 seconds from the Prime Minister, 30 seconds to the Opposition Leader. It's nowhere else in the world you have this sort of
I think
access.
it's quite extraordinary in that extent, really, because you can arrive at work, you can walk into King's Hall and you might bump into the Prime Minister. You can walk down the other lobby and bump into the Opposition Leader. It's this enormous intimacy for which there's no substitute as far as the journalist is concerned.
And they're non-pretentious. This is quite important. The building up there is just quite a different level of grandeur, of pretentiousness, of symbolism.
To me, this has been uncomfortable, but beautiful. Small is beautiful. The new Parliament House is going to be a problem. It's going to be one of the world's loveliest buildings. It's going to cost over $1 billion. It's not going to make one iota of difference to the functioning of government or the efficiency of Parliament.
This is the Parliamentary Library, in which all the memory of this building hovers and lingers, and all the memory of Canberra too, that artificial construct of warring, embittered colonies, unwillingly joined together in an irksome federation. The local rural property had the name Canberra. It was said to mean a meeting place. It was first purchased by one Lieutenant Joshua Moore of Cabramatta in 1826. 100 years later, it indeed became the meeting place of the Australian nation, though after much furious parliamentary indecision. 48 sites were proposed, and a committee of inquiry preferred a 49th, Dalgety. The Senate, after much debate, preferred Bombala, the House of Representatives, Chumut. A joint committee came out for Dalgety, but there were constitutional difficulties, and wrangling members went on a tour of the other possibilities. They were driven out of Albury by a fierce dust storm. At Bombala, William Morris Hughes, who was to become Prime Minister, listened to an argument as to who was the genuine man from the Snowy River. A fight in the bar settled it. At Dalgety, there was a singing contest between a representative of the press and a representative of the Parliament. The pressman singing "The Death of Nelson" and the parliamentarian singing "Let me like a soldier fall." The quest went on. It took 8 further years of exploration, quarrel and reflection to reach a final decision. It was to be 18 years before Parliament pulled up its roots and moved its goods and chattels to the chosen site of Canberra. Many civil servants resisted the move, describing the new seat of power as a handful of hovels in a howling wilderness. The best account of its beginnings comes from a visitor, A.P. Herbert, later Sir Alan Herbert, then editor of Punch. I crawled under a ladder, put my foot in some cement, and entered the great Parliament House. We heard a noise like a battle. Our guide peered through a forest of beams into a space floored with corrugated iron, in the middle of which a concrete mixer was noisily at work. "That is the Senate," he shouted. He took us to look at a crowd of men hard at work in a cloud of dust. The lower house, he said with a proud gesture. Finally, they took us out to a great terrace. Our friend pointed to an empty field and said, "That is the National Library." Remarkable, we said, and so it was. For at that moment there was passing through the National Library a real Australian cow. The year was 1955. The Labour Party, torn and traumatised by sectarianism, the anti-communist issue, and the unstable personality of Dr. Evatt, and further lacerated by the wounding tongue of R.G. Menzies, went down in a large defeat. And I, aged 29, as the new member for the Brisbane seat of Moreton, came to roost along this corridor in these cramped quarters which I shared with another fledgling backbencher, Malcolm Fraser. He was huge in dimension and hard to live with because of his habit of talking on 2 phones at once and administering his family property in rigorous detail by long-distance connection. For the average parliamentary novice, his tiny shared office, unblessed in those days by such amenities as electric jugs and sinks and refrigerators, was only one of his many inconveniences. Others included the many practical jokes played on him by one Jim Killen, the free suit I assured him he was entitled to as a new member from Fletcher Jones, the urgent invitations to appear on national television that proved to be illusions. Yes, life was hard and puzzling, but eventually he found his way about. One of the first places he found was the parliamentary dining room, where with amazement he would watch the famous come in and go out, confer, conspire, or if in Coventry, as my friend Fred Daly was for 7 years, dine alone, or with 2 or 3 other solitary comrades, also suffering internal exile. He would learn to read the auguries in this room, decipher the groupings and the body language, the whispers and the winks over morning tea and afternoon tea, and seek to get those invitations to other places in this great building of conference and resort, invitations that might make or damage him in the end. From 1955 to 1969, as a private member, I occupied this seat. And from this vantage point, I watched with fascination Sir Robert Menzies at the centre table next to the dispatch box. He would sit with his large leonine head resting on his fist. When he was asked a question, he'd pick up a pencil and pretend to write, but he never actually did so. I remember his great speech at the time of the Suez Canal crisis. Referring to the agreement covering the Suez Canal, he said, "You cannot water this down without washing it away." And from this position, I could see Dr. Evatt sitting at the opposite dispatch box, running his fingers through his tousled hair, seemingly indifferent to the crumpled appearance of his suit. When he spoke, books and papers were strewn all over the table and over the dispatch box. He never had the elegance of advocacy of Menzies, but Evatt the enigma, his speeches read lucidly in Hansard next morning. He probably was best summed up by his colleague Leslie Halen, like a summer storm. Perhaps the fieriest member to sit in this chamber was E.J. Eddie Ward. I watched many jousts between Ward and Menzies. Menzies was superb in making occasional speeches, particular condolence speeches. He was speaking one day, Ward leant across to Arthur Colwell and said, When I go, I want none of this. What do you want, said Arthur. I just want Ming to get up and say, he was loved by all. When Ward died, Menzies gave a very beautiful speech, and I congratulated him on it. How do you do it? He looked at me and said, Killen, every human being in this world has some redeeming feature. I suspect if we worked at it long enough, we'd find one in you. In those days, parliamentary sitting hours were strange, to say the least. It was not uncommon for this chamber to sit frequently after midnight, and of course with disastrous effects upon members because they'd go to sleep. Not the brightest of ideas, no doubt. There was an unwritten rule that if we sat after 12, we'd get supper of sausages. Not infrequently, I would walk back to the Kurrajong Hotel with the sun getting up. It was in 1969 that John Gorton appointed me a junior minister and I moved to this seat. It was from this seat that I witnessed the last 2 years of the government led by John Gorton. I can recall the distress on his face as he sat at the table, listening to what I regarded as a cruel, lacerating speech made by Malcolm Fraser.
Quote, the Prime Minister, because of his unreasoned drive to get his own way, his obstinacy, impetuous and emotional reaction...
It was the beginning of the end of the government
and the public service. I do not believe he is fit to hold the great office of Prime Minister.
You had the unique experience of being Prime Minister of this country without holding a seat in either house.
That's right. I had to resign from the Senate before running for the by-election at Higgins. And I think for a month or 5 weeks, maybe longer, I can't remember, I didn't have a seat in either house. The Constitution allows you to do that and to run for 3 months, after which you're finished.
Did the office of Prime Minister give you a sense of exhilaration?
Oh, yes. Yes. It still does when you look back at all the things that happened and you think you're the last Prime Minister and largely responsible for that happening.
Did it ever depress you?
Oh, yes. It depressed me. When you wanted something to happen and couldn't get it through. And I was in a lot of, I wouldn't say constant depression, but depression a lot of times with our own backbench. 6 or 8 people on the backbench always criticising me.
This, to say the obvious, is a place where the Prime Minister is exposed to constant scrutiny. Mm-hmm. Did the gallery worry you at all?
Well, yes, the press gallery worried me a lot because they started writing things about me indicating that I was a libertine of, great force and character, which I wasn't, but they were all copying it one from the other. It annoyed me to a certain extent.
Could I ask you how you felt when you gave a casting vote against your own?
Well, I felt the same as I feel now, that it's virtually, I won't say impossible, but it's very improbable that you can carry on as Prime Minister with only half of your party saying that they've got full confidence in you, or one more than half. You've got so many others who are against what you want to do, and so you give it to somebody else and see what they can do. I didn't know he'd be as bad as he was, but that's what I thought at the time.
In 1972, to my dismay, but by no means entirely to my surprise, the McMahon government was swept from office, and we were now back on the opposition benches. And for the next 3 years from this seat, I watched the turbulent, interesting Whitlam years.
Men and women of Australia.
Now, you sat in this chamber for more than a quarter of a century.
Yes.
And you sat in that chair as Prime Minister for 3 years. Did you enjoy yourself?
Yes, and I always observed that you enjoyed it, and I suppose that's the reason why we have continued our friendship no longer as members of Parliament.
Why did you enjoy it, though, so openly?
I thought the place was significant. I thought there were things to do here, things which could be done in no other way or by any other persons. And I've always been interested in raising issues. I'm a do-gooder, I'm a reformer. So I would always look for issues where the people here could affect improvements in our society or economy.
You enjoyed argument, though, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Well, that's partly, I suppose, being a lawyer by training.
I've never been inhibited about saying it, but I always rated you as one of the finest parliamentary performers I ever saw at work. Now, I hope that doesn't hurt your feelings.
I'm not going to argue with you on that point.
Aren't you? Yes. Well, now, parliamentary performance can make a leader or break an opponent.
Unquestionably.
You used ridicule and scorn and, a powerful indigenous wit to devastating advantage. May I simply recall to your mind, when I was asked to no longer serve by a Prime Minister of this country, I didn't sit down and sob about it, but you were dealing with my dismissal, if that word doesn't injure, and you mentioned my successor, and I said, what do you think of him? Without a moment's hesitation, you looked across and said, a smaller calibre and a bigger bore. Now, governments are made or broken in this chamber, therefore...
And the leaders of parties are made or broken in this chamber. Even if governments are not defeated, leaders can be changed because of their performance in this place.
There's nothing we can do about it, but I hold a sense of regret that Parliament is moving from this place to the new House. Do you share in that regret? Or am I really being nostalgic?
I have, well, maybe you are. I don't want to express a view on it. I must confess the new Parliament House has the fragrance of Brasilia about it as far as I'm concerned. And I first became acquainted with this building when it was a very much smaller building when I came to Canberra at the beginning of the school year in 1928. And for a quarter of a century, because my parents lived the rest of their lives here, I was familiar with this building as the raison d'etre for Canberra and as the centre of Canberra for a quarter of a century before I came and worked in it for a quarter of a century and more myself. Now, I don't say it's a building of any architectural distinction. It's not a patch, for instance, on the Houses of Parliament in Westminster or the Congress in Washington or the House of Parliament in Canada or in New Delhi. But I'm inclined to think to have the building in its new site is being a bit vainglorious of the Parliament. We're being a bit grandiose, but it's there.
There's nothing we can do about it.
Exactly. And I would preserve this building not because of its architectural or aesthetic distinction, but because of the contribution which was made by so many of us distinguished persons in it during the 60 years that it was the premier legislative chamber in our nation.
A lot of people have been puzzled by the fact that across this table very firm friendships have been formed. In other words, people are dominated by their political allegiances. You were never of that ilk.
Oh, I've always preserved the civilities on both sides of the House. There might be one or two people that I thought were unspeakable opposite me, but by and large I'm not a good hater. That may be a political deficiency.
Contemporary political parties have spared those miseries.
Oh, yes.
I exchanged countless notes and telegrams and letters with you. Would you be distressed if I were to tell you I've kept them all?
No, I thought they were the best feature of your latest book.
It started out at first, I thought it was something of a joke. The offer of Australian ambassadorship to Spain. At the end, I wasn't quite so sure, and during the closing months of your Prime Ministership, I sent you a note, which I have here. It simply reads, My dear chap, that was always the form of a jest. Which, consistent with my talents, is available? Spain, London, Moscow, Peking. Do you know what you replied? 2 words. Still Spain. Now, is it that you thought that I would get on famously with General Franco that the offer was made?
That was the original thought, although I've always conceded that as your children became adults, you improved them. You were to the left of Franco in the end.
I don't want to exhume, which is an old controversy, but the events of 1975. Do you think this country could endure something comparable today?
I don't think it would. I mean, I would say that the fact that everything was done in an orderly and peaceful manner after the 11th was due to the fact that I had emerged and survived in the Parliament, and I was going to do what I could to see that the parliamentary processes, including the election which was then going to be held, went according to proper styles and rules.
If the Senate rejects supply and the lower house is sent to the country, you take the view that the Senate also should go to the country?
Oh, no question of that. I mean, that's been my attitude on the record since the middle 1950s, the Joint Committee on Constitutional Review. I've always thought it was monstrous that the Senate or any legislative council in the states could produce an unworkable parliament and thus an election for the House of Representatives or the Assembly, and then the upper house not go at the same time.
This brings us back to where you began. You always regarded Parliament as a place where you could pursue issues.
Oh, entirely.
And while Parliament is preserved and exists as a forum, issues can be pursued by men and by women who have the talent, the skill and the determination to do just that.
It is a great forum, the greatest.
The events of 1975, November the 11th, led to a most extraordinary election. It also led, I believe, to an extraordinary change in the camaraderie of this place. There was a change of government and I became a senior minister in the government led by Malcolm Fraser. I was to sit for nearly 7 years in this seat. John Malcolm Fraser, Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. A tense, industrious man, he had a remarkable capacity for work. There were times when I felt he did not quite understand that all those around him had the same capacity. At that dispatch box, reading a speech, there was something quite unrelenting about his style and manner. He drove himself on. It is said that that manner alienated Don Chipp from Malcolm Fraser. Don Chipp was not appointed to the second Fraser government. He was to resign from the Parliamentary Liberal Party, and his resignation led directly to the formation of the Australian Democrats. And the same manner, it is said, led to the resignation of Andrew Peacock, where from that seat in his resignation speech, he used the same language against Malcolm Fraser that Malcolm Fraser 10 years previously had used against John Gorton.
He has bypassed the system of government by acting with a manic determination to get his own way, and I find the constant disloyalty and erratic acts of behaviour intolerable and not to be endured.
In 1983, we were swept from office. I had no feeling for opposition. I decided to go. Probably that was a mistake. I miss it. I miss it all very much. This is the Senate, which Sir Arthur Fadden once described as splendid proof of life after death. Back when he said that, of course, the Senate was like the House of Lords, a dozy, club-like retirement home for union officials and party stalwarts. A talking shop, a debating society with no great power over events or government policy. That analysis has changed. Three of the people who have seen that change are with me now. The Right Honourable Reg Withers, the Honourable John Button, and the Honourable Jim McClellan. Gentlemen, what brought about that change?
Lionel Murphy. Lionel taught us that if you have a power and a right, you ought to exercise it.
And that was done through the building up of the committee system?
Through the committee systems, through the way he ran the opposition, the way he ran the debates.
Well, Lionel's only way to get into Parliament, according to the complicated pre-selection methods of the Labor Party, was to run for the Senate. And so he was determined, when he got to the Senate, to make the Senate important enough for his own glorification. His motivation was that the Senate had to be important because he was here.
The Senate today is no longer a debating society.
What do you mean by when you say it's not a debating
society? It used to be a very leisurely.
Or it's now a reading society.
Why?
Because everybody reads their speeches prepared outside, and the awful thing is that so many of them stumble over words that they've never seen in their life before. It's quite sad at times.
But the role of the Senate, John Button, has it changed completely?
Oh yes, I would describe it as a not very good debating society now, which is probably what Reg Withers is saying. But I remember people here when I was first here, like old Reg Wright, and people mightn't remember him with favour. I do, because I think he was a great sort of thespian debater, you know. He used to turn it on.
You know, it's a bit like that great story which is alleged to have been told by Harold Holt when he was opposing the increase in the Parliament back in 1948.
What, the size of the Parliament?
The size of the Parliament. He was horrified, he said, that of course the Senate should be increased. And his story went wide the other day, on Monday. I met a senator, terribly excited. He'd received a letter. And he told me that on Tuesday he would open it, on Wednesday he would read it, Thursday he would reply to it, and Friday he would post it. A senator's electoral work for the week. Now, I think it's somewhat changed since then.
Am I in error in saying that, by and large, the majority of Australians reject the notion that the Senate is superior in power to the House of Representatives?
Well, I think they think it's superior in some ways. I mean, they regard the House of Representatives as a rabble, which is pretty right, if you listen to it, and the Senate is less of a rabble.
Lasting impressions of this place, have you got one?
I'm reminded of this morning as I drive in and I see that monster going up on Capitol Hill. I remember there was
the monster?
The new Parliament House that we could all do without for various reasons, and there was a free debate on where the new Parliament House should be sited. And John was a new chum then, and he came to me rather nervously and lobbied me to support him in opposing it being put on Capitol Hill. It was a free vote. It was a free vote. John and I had a lot of fun that night. I remember giving voice to my opposition to presumptuous erections.
I think that the greatest thing I remember about this place is, mainly through the committee system, how it's broken down political prejudices in a personal sense across party barriers. The great advantage of working on Senate committees, you discover that your political opponent hasn't got horns in his head, and that he's not out to wreck the country. And at the committee level, you can work in a very civilised manner, and there are occasionally more respect across the parties in this chamber for each other than there is within the parties.
I've never quite made that discovery about my opponents not having horns in their head, but I'm a bit behind him.
Jim McClellan.
It was a rather civilised place when I was here, but civilisation can get boring. After all, if you didn't stir up a little bit of trouble while you're down here, it'd be a much more soporific existence than it is. I liked a little bit of trouble when I was here. It relieved the boredom.
But I called some at 75 and you got upset.
This is the party room, where for more than a quarter of a century, I watched with fascination the parade of Liberal Party leadership, always from this chair and from this point of view of the table, where they sat and presided and exerted their influence. It was here I saw John Gorton broken by his own casting vote, Bill McMahon briefly and fatefully exalted, Bill Snedden humiliated, Malcolm Fraser triumphant. Here it was too that Andrew Peacock committed political suicide and John Howard was then surprisingly elected in a few dramatic moments. These men commanded the numbers of the day, a mysterious ability, one I never shared. And here, in similar surroundings, in the Labor Party room, I have the Honourable Mick Young. Now, tell me, you've always placed a lot of store on humour. Why?
Because I think that it's important. This is a serious business, politics, government, policies, but it's best not to take yourself too seriously because people outside don't. And sometimes you can see or hear people make a long-winded speech that they've been preparing for weeks and no one takes a scrap of notice of it. But one line of humour can destroy a speech, can destroy a person for a week or a day, and is remembered by everybody.
We started off talking about numbers. Do you place much on polls in the sense of, do they guide you, influence you in your decision-making?
Well, not during the term of government, because you know you're going to make decisions which people won't like from time to time, but they're not going to have elections every month. And I think that we've reached a stage of almost lunacy in Australia. We have polls on everything, you know. Do you like paying tax? 87% of those interviewed yesterday said they don't like paying tax. Now, that comes as a surprise to everybody, doesn't it? Do you believe in motherhood? 99% of those interviewed yesterday, 1% were undecided.
Now, tell me, performance in the Parliament, what store do you place by that?
Well, within the building, enormous. Outside the building, limited. But I say within the building because I as a backbencher and as a parliamentarian, I think the performance, particularly of a leader or ministers, is of the utmost importance to the morale of the people that sit behind you. So that if you've got bad performers, you're going to have low morale.
And with a parliamentary leader, if he's relaxed, impressive in the House, that has an effect on those who sit behind.
He's going to stay as leader.
Why is it that people outside the Parliament don't put such store by parliamentary performance?
They don't witness it. They're not able to see it. It's something that's distant from them. I mean, if we'd have built Parliament House in Sydney or Melbourne, where hundreds of thousands more Australians could go in and witness it, perhaps they'd become more familiar with what it is. It's like the theatre. I mean, people know Sir Laurence Olivier's a great performance in the theatre because they've been able to watch him over the years. But in his field, he was no better performer than, say, Whitlam or Menzies in their theatre, because this really is, you know, a theatrical performance.
Yes. I once said of you, do you recall it, that you were determined to appear as rough a political practitioner as you were as Shearer, and if that is lost, I ask people to bear in mind he used more tar on his sheep in the shearing sheds than they used on the air highway, and you just looked at me and laughed.
No, I didn't. I said, I reminded you what else I was taught in the shearing sheds, and that was to beware of men with hair on their face.
Is that so? Well, Mick, thank you, and thank you again. These are the ministerial offices. For more than 7 years, I served in government led by John Malcolm Fraser. The extraordinary thing about ministerial power is that it is both a stimulant and a depressant. Vast volumes of paper to be moved, Long hours, 16, 18 hours a day. Anxiety never very far away. As Minister for Defence, I was dealing with a very complex and a very, very expensive department. Yes, technology had swept on, and so indeed had the cost of a great variety of capital equipment. And defence planning is so totally different from what it was years ago, because decisions taken today reach out and concern the generation of tomorrow. But apart from all the anxiety, there was, of course, the opportunity to have a rare insight into humanity. I was on board a ship on one occasion, dressed in overalls. A stoker came to me and said, "What's your name?" I told him. I got his name. He said, "What do you do?" I looked at him and said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I happen to be the minister." He said simply, "Smart bastard." It was the kindest and certainly the most flattering thing ever said about me during my term as Minister for Defence. And here, the Cabinet Room, where it is one of the ultimates of political ambition to sit. A fractious place, full of tension, rivalry, old wounds and long exhaustion, and at times good humour. I would wait here 10 hours sometimes for the meeting finally, always finally, to get around to my expensive department and its furious discussion of the billions of dollars required. Unity is all. Are we for it or against it? Lord Melbourne once asked. It doesn't matter which, but we must all say the same thing. A vote was taken in this room on the television advertising of cigarettes. There were 8 votes against a ban, 6 votes for a ban. The Prime Minister declared there would be a ban. As Richard Crosman notes in his diaries, Prime Ministers know how to count. And this is the office of the Prime Minister. I have known 8 Prime Ministers who have sat in this office. Here is indeed the pinnacle of power. And yet it can be a very lonely place. The stress upon the holder of the office of Prime Minister is today very substantial, and security considerations are very substantial too. That was not always the case. Prime Ministers could leave this office and leave this building, and scant attention was given to it. Probably the situation is best explained by the simple story told of a very famous Test umpire. A threat had been made against his life. Sir Robert Menzies went to see him at the Melbourne cricket ground. "What's this, my dear fellow? A threat made against your life? Here it is, I've walked from my hotel through the gardens to this cricket ground. Nobody took any notice of me. But, Prime Minister, you should understand, good Test umpires are hard to come by." Great oaks from little acorns grow. This giant pharaonic addendum to the small, vigorous, uncomfortable building in which our democracy bloomed and flowered and had its caustic, aggressive and eloquent being is a measure perhaps of how in the years since 1927 our political egos have grown. In this handsome and costly successor to the Taj Mahal and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, where a Prime Minister may preen himself in splendid isolation, the public and press kept out by his Praetorian Guard, much presidential self-delusion and Watergate-style mischief, I believe, is now possible, where in the cramped intimacy of yesteryear it was not. This, I think, is a pity. It was a near-run thing. There were alternative proposals. One was to evict the journalists and occupy their premises. Another was to extend the old Parliament House. But now, $1 billion later, it is too late. And so, goodbye Parliament House, its marble and oak and gold, its ghosts and its glimmerings, now shuffling off the stage and dragging its feet, seemingly unwilling to be gone. What is to become of this place of memories? Is it to become a constitutional museum? Is it to become a convention centre for visiting Japanese? I hope not, but one thing is certain, its past is not to be shrugged off. This is Magna Carta. It was at Runnymede, in a meadow near the River Thames, that King John put his seal to Magna Carta. The king did not sign, the king could not write. It was the beginning of British parliamentary democracy. This building has been a chapter in that democracy. That chapter now closes. The next chapter lies elsewhere.
Tomorrow morning, ABC will bring you a special coverage of the opening of the new Parliament House by Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. This special event will also include entertainment by Julie Anthony and the National Youth Orchestra. Join us tomorrow morning at 10:15 for our special coverage of the opening of Parliament House here on ABC National Television.